Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I have 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. We want to welcome you to our webinar on Massachusetts drought declarations and messaging. I'm Joe Deli-Carpini, the Science and Operations Officer at the National Weather Service, Boston Norton, and I'm going to hand it over to our Senior Service Hydrologist, Nicole Belk, who will make some of our introductions, and then we'll get underway. Nicole, take it away.
Thanks very much, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, we have a few guest speakers this afternoon, including Vandana Rao, Director of Water Policy, Mass Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Ann Carroll, Director of Office of Water Resources, Mass Department of Conservation and Recreation, and also Gardner Bent, Hydrologist, United States Geological Survey, USGS. And I will also have a turn speaking part of this presentation as well. And Vandana, I believe you will be starting off the presentation.
Thank you, Nicole and Joe. Good afternoon, everybody, and appreciate the time you're taking to be with us this afternoon to learn a little bit more about droughts and drought declaration here in Massachusetts. I will talk a little bit about our process, how we declare a drought, what kinds of considerations go into the declaration, who makes the declaration, what's our process, where are we at today, as well as some outreach messages that we have been putting out and would love for partners like you to help disseminate with communities and the public at large. Just by way of introduction, my name is Vandana Rao. I'm the Director of Water Policy at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, as Nicole said. I also chair the Drought Management Task Force along with MEMA, that's the Emergency Management Agency. And I also am the director for the Massachusetts Water Resources Commission. The staff to the Water Resources Commission is also staffed to the Drought Task Force and does all the analytics and provides the scientific underpinnings and background for a lot of what we do on the Drought Task Force. So let's dive right into the next slide. So we do have a plan in Massachusetts. A drought management plan was updated in September of 2019. The first such plan was developed in the early 2000s as a result of the drought of the late 90s and early 2000s. We've used that for many years, and based on some of the experience that we had during and post the 2016-2017 drought, we realized that a lot has changed in the way that analysis of drought information was conducted. Our understanding of water resources and droughts has certainly increased. And there were many aspects of the plan that needed an update in terms of actions, who is doing what kind of coordination is necessary at the state end, and so on. So we went through a multi-year process and developed a new and improved, but really, using the underpinnings of the earlier plan as a strong basis for this new plan. So we have an updated plan that we released in September of 2019, and we've already had to use it this year. It's been very helpful in terms of both the analytics as well as the preparedness and response actions. Next slide. So in order for us to determine drought, there are several aspects of the hydrological cycle or water droplet, if you will, that we take into consideration. Obviously, precipitation is a big factor. How much rain we get has a huge role to play in our overall conditions, but we also look at what happens to the rain once it hits the ground. How much of it is in the streams, how much seeps into the ground, how much gets collected in impoundments, lakes and ponds across the Commonwealth. What is the level of moisture that exists in the soil as well as in vegetation around, and both those are captured in the bottom two indices that you see, the fire danger index and the crop moisture index. So we look at various aspects of this, of the hydrological system, and really looking at it as a system as a whole to see what is the impact of this drought on various aspects. Next slide. So in Massachusetts, we have certain thresholds that define the levels of drought. And through our drought update plan, we have outlined 4 levels of drought. Level 0 is a normal condition. The level 1, 2, 3, and 4 increase in severity from mild drought, significant drought, critical drought, and finally to an emergency drought condition. And for each of these, there are several factors, including the indices you saw on the previous slide, that help to determine whether we are in a level 1 or a level 2, and so on. Next slide, please. So this is just giving a little bit of information of what we look at a slightly drilled down level. So for each of our indices, we have divided the data or the analysis into buckets of 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, with 4 being the most severe and 0 being a normal condition. So for example, for precipitation, stream flow, groundwater, and lakes and impoundments, for those lakes and impoundments, for those 4 indices, the data is, we use percentiles as a way to look at where the data is, and depending on the conditions on the ground and the percentile level that we see in a particular region, we would associate that with an index severity level. So for example, if it is between the 30th and the 20th percentile for that particular index, it would end up being at a severity level of 1. For Keach-Byram drought index and crop moisture index, you see the way the data breaks out. So this is a very clear and easy to communicate and really much more advanced way compared to what we were doing before, of looking at the data and comparing apples to apples, and really having a much more deliberative way of comparing where we are at today compared to what it should be or what it normally is if we were not in a drought. Next slide. So Massachusetts is a small state. However, different parts of the state do experience precipitation differently, do experience the drought impacts differently. And so we have divided the state into 7 regions. This is, we have the Western region, the Connecticut River Valley region, the Central region, Northeast region, Southeast region, Cape Cod region, and the Islands region. So there are 7 in all. And we look at each of those 6 indices in every one of these regions to help us determine what the condition of that particular region is. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit and shift gears. We've seen the data and what we analyze and at what scale. I do want to talk about how we go about doing this. There is a drought management task force that has been around in the state for just about 20 years now. And the task force is chaired by Energy and Environmental Affairs, the agency that I am a part of, and the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. It is represented by several of the entities that you see on the slide in front of you. We have several state agencies, several federal agencies, and a handful of other partners. And the idea behind this task force is really for members with expertise in all those indices that you saw earlier to weigh in on the condition of those indices, where the data is at, to provide us with on-the-ground information, especially in areas where we may not have as much data, but we know people from our agencies or the federal agencies are out there monitoring and doing sort of work on a daily basis. We also have the National Weather Service that brings other kinds of information to the table, and our partners talk about how impacts directly affect them at the local level. Next slide. So here's sort of a broad list of topics that get reported at the Drought Management Task Force each time the task force meets. Obviously, we talk about the hydrological conditions, what's happening to all those indices in each of those regions. The National Weather Service in particular brings some really critical information on weather and the forecast. Although the weather and forecast don't play into the analytical part of our consideration, it plays a big role in the qualitative aspect of our discussions at the Drought Management Task Force meetings. Knowing what is coming up in terms of weather over a weekend or in the next week or in the next 2 or 3 weeks really helps inform the Drought Task Force and their deliberative process on drought levels. We also hear about water supply impacts in terms of any feedback we're getting through some of the task force members from local municipalities and how the drought is impacting their groundwater or reservoir levels. We get a fair amount of information on environmental impacts, such as drying streams, any fish kills, increase in aquatic invasive species, perhaps at lakes and ponds, and more recently, several streams saw more stagnant water and therefore saw more instances of algal blooms. We get a good amount of feedback on agricultural impacts from our colleagues at Department of Agricultural Resources. Some of you may recall in 2016, 2017, during that drought, the farming community in Massachusetts was fairly heavily impacted, and we start to hear about those types of impacts here at the Drought Task Force. Fire danger is another very critical part of what we look at. During this drought, as well as certainly in 2016, 2017, the fire danger levels were at a heightened scale, and it is something that we take very seriously because we want to make sure, one, that things don't go out of hand, but also that we have enough water supply to help meet the demands of fire protection. So a lot of that plays into the conversation we have with the task force. And then finally, any impacts on infrastructure and then public health impacts as a result of inadequate water. Next slide. So in terms, very quickly on the process, our staff, in particular the staff at DCR, that is staff to the task force, through a cooperative program with federal agencies and some of our own monitoring that we do at the state level, gathers the information, analyzes it, and presents the data to the task force. The task force members share additional data and information on the topics that I just talked about. The task force deliberates on where things are at in each region after taking a good look at the data and all this additional information, and they recommend a drought level for each region. So at the end of every task force meeting, we come out with a recommendation of a drought level for each of the 7 regions in the state. That recommendation goes up to the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs. The Secretary weighs and considers the recommendation of the task force and makes the final drought declaration for the state of Massachusetts. And this drought declaration comes out in the form of a press release, and typically that is released a day or two after the task force meeting. So that is sort of the official drought declaration and drought call for the state of Massachusetts. Next slide, please. So just as a quick recap, we have 4 levels of drought: mild drought, significant drought, critical drought, and emergency drought. Each of these names, the nomenclature really was purposefully coined to help communicate the increasing intensity of drought at each level. And the percentiles on the right give you a quick snapshot of the severity levels for each of those. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Ann Carroll from DCR to just walk us through some of the data and the spread of information that we gather for each of our task force meetings. Ann?
Thank you so much, Vandana. So this first map shows our precipitation data, and what I want to highlight is, first of all, just giving you a little bit more detail about the data that are behind our decision when we're determining a drought, but also that really behind each of these dots is a dedicated volunteer, or in many cases, a network of folks that are bringing this data to us. So this network is a combination of both the National Weather Service cooperative network as well as DCR's observation network. Altogether, there are over 100 observers that report into us. And these folks are measuring precip every day, 365 days a year. So we're deeply indebted to them for this service. And then there's the whole network of staff behind it that are then collecting that data, doing the quality checks on it, and then crunching it, as Vandana said, and analyzing it. And ultimately, this shows you we've been working on trying to visualize the data and putting together a dashboard, which we hope to be releasing soon. But this map gives you a sense of, again, for this indicator, it shows our data points, and then they're colored based on where they're falling along those drought levels, whether they're in a level 1, 2, 3, 4, or in a normal condition or above normal. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next 2 slides are going to show you our stream flow network and our groundwater network. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gardner Bent from USGS, our partner, to just say a little bit more. So at a high level, hopefully what you can see from this map is that we are blessed with an excellent network here. We have a good coverage across the state of data for stream flow, and the same is true for groundwater. And again, these networks have a period of record that in some cases goes back almost 100 years. So the state has had a partnership with USGS where we co-fund this network, and they run it for us for over 100 years. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pass it over to Gardner Bent, our partner at USGS, just to say a little bit more, just give you a few more highlights about the network. Gardner, you might be muted. Or I don't know if the organizers can see whether Gardner is on.
Yeah, I see him on. He's on and muted. He can click on the microphone there, Gardner. That should, there you go.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry, everyone. I kept clicking it and it just said I was muted, so I couldn't do anything about it. So, Anne gave a great overview that this network is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and Mass DCR, Mass DEP, and Mass EOEA. We've been collecting data at many of these stations. We have about 120 real-time stream gauges across the state. And so those are collecting 15-minute data, about sometimes a little less than that. And it gets transmitted hourly up to the websites. And we have data that goes back, as Ann said, over 100 years. So we're able to look at droughts that have occurred during different time periods, whether it's the mid-1960s or the early 2000s or the recent drought in 2016 and 17. And nationwide, we have about 8,000 stream gauges that we operate, a few solely by the USGS, but most of them are in partnerships with other federal and state agencies. So we can go to the groundwater network. Or that slide. Yeah, there we go. So within Massachusetts, we have over 100 wells within the state. And some of these wells, about 50 of them are real time. So again, we transmit the data hourly up to the website. And then the other 50 plus are essentially their monthly tape downs, which are done by Mass DCR folks and Mass DEP folks and UMass folks. And again, this observation well network is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and Mass DCR, Mass DEP, and Mass EOEA. And these have data that there's a few sites that go back to the mid-1930s or mid-1940s. Most of them are about 60 years old. But again, we can use this network to look at what occurred during previous droughts. And nationwide, we operate about over 18,000 wells. But some of these are only measured once a year because that's all they can do. But here we're extremely blessed by a very large and network that has a lot of real-time sites. So anyways, That's all I have. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Gardner. Just one more thing I want to highlight again, the people behind this, Gardner mentioned for the half of the wells that are not real time, a person actually goes out every month, you know, again, 365 days a year, and takes a measurement and brings that back, and that gets reported up in the QA/QC and all that goes into this. So there's a tremendous network of folks behind this data. Next slide, please. Okay, so this shows our indicator lakes and impoundments. This network is not quite as robust, although so we're working on expanding it, but we do have enough data that is very helpful to us nonetheless. Most of these are reservoirs where we have staff, public water suppliers that are every month letting us know what their water levels are. And then we do have a few that are just natural water bodies where we have instrumentation through USGS to measure the water height. And that's the area where we're working to expand that to just give us a little bit more data. But this is also a very important network to us. Next slide, please. Here you see our basically our fire danger indicator, which is our Keach Byram Drought Index, which is, again, coming back one more time to the people on the ground within every region, within the DCR fire districts that are gathering the data and crunching up these numbers and giving us these data for each region. This slide in particular, our chief forester put together for our last drought task force meeting, showing a comparison of how the numbers were looking this summer, as we are in a drought, compared to the last major drought we had, which was in 2016. So here you can see that we have a very good spread of data on the ground, and another important part of our decision making. Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide, please. So here you see reflected on this map, this is when you roll all that up, as Vandana said, and we talked about the data and the spread of data in the process, ultimately you get a declaration. And this map shows the latest, where we are currently with the state. We're at a level 2 in every region across the state, based on the last declaration from the secretary, which came from the task force recommendation. We will be revisiting this on Thursday, and we hope some of you may join us for that drought management task force meeting. And I think, next slide, please. I think at this point, yes. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand it over. There's another drought product, which a number of you are probably familiar with, which is the US Drought Monitor, which complements what we do. There's some differences and some similarities, and I'm going to hand it over now to Nicole Belk to talk a little bit more, just a little bit about the Drought Monitor, so we can see where the similarities and differences lie and how the two products complement each other.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, so now that you've seen the Mass Drought Management Plan information, how drought levels are determined at the state level, let's take a look at the product most of you have likely already seen, which is the US Drought Monitor. This US Drought Monitor map is the latest version, is valid Tuesday, August 25th. And the US Drought Monitor map is published every Thursday by 8 a.m. Eastern Time. This map shows, we see there's 4 different drought levels ranging from D0, abnormally dry, to D4, exceptional drought. And obviously the higher the number, the worse the drought. And white, there's no drought conditions going on at that location. And for much of New England, we are in moderate to severe drought. And if you kind of like the levels, it's similar in intensity level as the mass drought level. So go ahead to the next slide, please. So when you talk about what the US Drought Monitor is, it provides a national overview of drought conditions. It's produced each week through a partnership between the National Drought Mitigation Center, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and also NOAA. Now, for each of these 3 agencies, there are a couple people selected to be designated as U.S. Drought Monitor authors. And every week, there's one author. They take turns authoring the product, the national product, each week. And the map is developed analyzing a variety of drought indices, short-term and long-term, including some that are also reviewed at the Mass Drought Management Task Force meetings, such as stream flow and standardized precipitation index. In addition to the weekly Drought Monitor author, you kind of see, well, where we have the what and the who, there are over 400 observers nationwide that participate in the weekly U.S. Drought Monitor creation process. And we do that by providing drought input at the local, state, and regional levels. This is mainly done through email, but sometimes it's done through conversations on phone or online if need be. The participants are from various backgrounds. I see if you look at the circle way on the bottom center, a lot of the folks are from NOAA. There are a lot of folks from National Weather Service that are part of the process, but there are also folks at the state and federal level, and it's including some folks from the USGS and state climatologists and some researchers at universities. Now, there are a few in Mass, like myself, that participate in both the weekly U.S. Drought Monitor discussion as well as the Mass Drought Management Task Force. So there is some interweaving, and that's why you tend to see consistency more often than not. And the input from the local observers contributing and providing input to the National Drought Monitor author, it helps to provide more of a boots on the ground validation of conditions and drought impacts on the national map. Okay, so next slide. So now I just want to kind of point out some similarities and differences between the U.S. Drought Monitor and the Mass Drought Management Task Force. So we'll look at each bullet from left to right. The U.S. Drought Monitor map updates weekly, and the Mass Drought Management Task Force typically has meetings and updates on a monthly basis during drought conditions. The Drought Monitor provides a nationwide view of drought conditions, and of course the Mass Drought Task Force focuses on Mass. The U.S. Drought Monitor has one author each week that makes the final decisions on the map, on the full national map. And for the Mass Drought Task Force, it's chaired by MEMA and EEA, and the Energy and Environmental Affairs Secretary makes the final decision on the drought level decision. For the Drought Monitor, looking specifically at the Northeast U.S., we have collaboration via email from over 60 state, federal, and research partners. And of course, that's part of that broader network I talked about nationally on the previous slide. All that input from folks in the Northeast is consolidated by the Northeast Regional Climate Center, and those recommendations are sent to the U.S. Drought Monitor author for the week for consideration. And for the Mass Drought Management Task Force, the monthly meetings typically have 40 to 60 attendees with input from state and federal and other partners. And the Drought Management Task Force ultimately makes the recommendations to the EEA Secretary. And now similarities here, the Drought Monitor utilizes a variety of drought indices, as does the Mass Drought Management Task Force. The U.S. Drought Monitor has limited subjective input because you have the region, about 60 or so participants from the Northeast contributing nationally, but for the Drought Management Task Force, you have a broader potential range of impacts discussed because you have a lot more folks at the local level specific to Mass. And the U.S. Drought Monitor is mainly a guidance and overview product. And the Mass Drought Management Task Force, with each drought level that's declared, prompts specific actions to be taken. So that's the overview of the looking at the Drought Monitor. And I think we'll go to the next slide, and we'll go back to Vandana.
Thank you, Nicole. So part of our reason why we wanted to cover both these sort of products is so folks who are listening in today and watching our slides can sort of get a better sense of what the two of them mean, and also have a better understanding of what the Massachusetts process is all about, and that we certainly have products that are very complementary and tied to each other very closely month to month. But certainly here in Massachusetts, we are really blessed with a lot of on-the-ground data that we take advantage of in addition to on-the-ground input of conditions at local levels. So that really gives us a sort of much more micro picture of what's happening to our communities and our habitats vis-a-vis drought conditions, whereas a drought monitor is perhaps we could call it as a more macro scale. So just quickly, this is sort of the the comparison, even in terms of the data, we would say that the drought monitor D0 is equivalent to our level 1, the drought monitor D1 is equivalent to our level 2, and we have sort of grouped the drought monitors D2 and D3 into a single level, which is a level 3 for us. So they're fairly comparable for many of our indices, but the official declaration for Massachusetts that is tied to current, more localized conditions, as well as actions that can and need to be taken at the local and state level to help mitigate those drought impacts, are really tied to the Massachusetts declaration by the Secretary of Environmental Affairs. Next slide, please. So I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about messaging, and all of you today here play some role in talking to your audiences at various levels about conditions that are related to drought and our hydrological conditions, our precipitation conditions, and what that means on the ground. And so we did want to take some time today to talk about some of this that we are putting out, and would love for all of you to help us in getting a similar message out there. And the first thing that we've developed this time around during this drought is some basic infographics, because a lot of times we get calls from folks that say, okay, I know we're in a drought, but what does that really mean? What can I do as an individual resident, or as an individual business owner, or a small business owner, or even in the case of some municipalities, they may say, okay, what is it that I should be telling local residents about the drought? So we've created these infographics that try to put together some of this information more succinctly. You have the drought level clearly shown in the map at the top. What does this mean? And we have several categories here about the rain, what's happening to the habitat, including streams, fire danger. That's something that affects everybody in every municipality, and for us to be thinking about and planning for. So we wanted to make sure we put that in here. And finally, if there's any strain on water supply, so we try to put some messaging across on that. And finally, at the bottom, you see what you can do. So at level 2, our guidance is for everybody to limit outdoor watering to handheld hoses or watering cans only, and not have their sprinklers running. And even that, we are asking for folks to do it after 5 p.m. and before 9 a.m. These are the times of day when there is minimal amount of evaporation. It's not quite as hot outside. It's very likely the water will stay in the ground and go down to the roots where it's needed. And so overall, our message is to minimize minimize all kinds of water use. And we have a website that we use to provide a lot of the information on drought, as well as drought conditions, and that's listed at the bottom. So I'm sharing this, and I'm going to, on the next few slides, shares a few more of these type of infographics. All of this is available on, or will shortly be available on that website. That's easily downloadable, and for any of you to use to spread the same kind of information out to your membership and your clients. Next slide, please. So we also created a couple of infographics on tips for saving water. This one is specifically related to outdoor water use. We have another one on indoor water use that I'll show shortly. But this is really trying to make it much more succinct, the messaging, as well as pleasing to look at and easy for people to sort of take and use in their everyday activities out in their lawns and landscapes. So the first, number 1, talks about how to limit the watering that based on the level. Number 2 throws in some smart principles on landscaping and how to maintain healthy soils, and basically overall decrease the amount of water that is needed. And the third point at the bottom talks about other types of water use and how it can be minimized in the other activities that people may engage in. And what we found is, in particular, because this year, because of COVID, and most folks are indoors or are at home or working from home, water use has tended to go up, because we're probably looking at our lawns and landscapes on an everyday basis during the day and seeing that things are drying, and the first assumption is let's water more. So we're seeing that water use has in fact gone up at a time of drought. And so we felt it even more important for us to put this message out that it's okay to let the lawn go dry. It's okay to be using less now. the lawn and landscape will come back once we start getting more rain. Next slide, please. And here are some tips on saving water indoors. These are things that we should be doing all the time anyway, but they become particularly important during a drought. And we want to make sure that this message goes out there that, fix your leaks. A lot of times what we would consider as a small drip in your tap, if it happens 24 hours a day and 30 to 31 days in a month, that tends to add up quite a bit. It also weighs heavily on your pocketbook. We want to make sure that people have the most efficient fixtures and appliances at home, and encourage communities to provide those types of incentives to their local residents. So here are some tips on how to save water indoors as well. Next slide. We've also this time, and for the first time, actually created some much more succinct messages that are social media ready. Either of these can be posted on Facebook, on Instagram, can be tweeted out. They're short sound bites, get a brief and succinct message across, and they're meant to be targeted, specifically in this case, for drought-related aspects of water conservation. So here are two that our agency has used and are often used by our other agencies as well, and we encourage all of you to take that. That there's a message, there's a photograph that communicates a certain type of use, and at the bottom you'll see the web link as well. Next slide, please. And this talks about a brown lawn, something that I mentioned a little while ago, and watering from a can, really encouraging people to be much more thoughtful and aware and efficient in how they use their water, both outdoors as well as indoors. So I think that's probably the last slide we have. And here is our contact information. Myself on the top left, Nicole Belk from National Weather Service, and Carol from DCR, and Gardner Ben from USGS. Feel free to reach out to any of us after this meeting if you have any questions or any clarifications, or would like for us to share any aspects of the photos or slides you see. I know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to everybody. I do want to also announce that our next Drought Management Task Force meeting is this Thursday, September 3rd, and the Drought website is at the bottom of the page there. The Zoom link for our task force meeting, this meeting is held virtually and not in person. The Zoom link and as well as the agenda are both available on our website. So we welcome all attendees, anybody who would like to participate or just listen in. It is a public meeting that is open to all. And this Thursday, we will be looking at the data and information from the month of August up until the end of August. And certainly things like the forecast or how the weather is looking like in the next few weeks will also play into it. But our main task is to look at how conditions have progressed over the course of this year up until, and mostly looking at the data from the month of August. So I will stop there. Happy to take any questions that folks have, and encourage you to get in touch with us if you have any other questions after this webinar. I'll hand it back to you, Nicole.
Yep, I'll take it, Vandana. Thank you, and to Nicole and Ann and Gardner. If anyone has a question, the easiest thing to do is use the raise your hand feature in your chat, and then I can unmute you. Okay, looks like we have a question from Carrie, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You are unmuted, so go ahead.
Thanks. Carrie Mackin used to be the executive director of the Ipswich River Watershed Association. And I want to note that in the past week, the Ipswich River flows have been, in some cases, only 2% of the flows that the USGS aquatic habitat study found were necessary to sustain the aquatic ecosystem. So I would think that would push it into the severe category, since flows are so extremely low compared to what the river needs. And I will also mention, as I had been appointed as a member of the Technical Advisory Committee for the Sustainable Water Management Initiative, even though DEP stopped telling me about the meetings. But I want to say that the result of that process was unsustainable water management. And so I wonder if EEA would consider revisiting the whole question of sustainable water management, and specifically whether it would consider using the USGS sustainable yield estimator instead of the regulations that DEP adopted. And I will mention that a former EEA secretary and a former assistant secretary both admitted that DEP made its decisions based on its view of who had the most political clout rather than based on science. So I think that I would hope that EEA would say that it needs to be revisited. What do you think?
Thank you, Karen. Very nice to connect with you again here. I know it's been several years, and hope you're doing well.
Likewise.
And appreciate your comments. I know that process obviously was frustrating for you and perhaps others too. It took us, it may not have landed exactly where people would have wanted, but certainly it took us far ahead on those Water Management Act regulations than where they were at prior to that process. I mean, we are constantly sort of looking at ways in which we can continue to enhance sustainable water management. And I think bringing it back to the drought and determination of drought conditions, as well as what we as a society and a state do in order to prepare for and mitigate the impacts of drought. If you haven't already, please do take a look at our drought management plan. The whole idea behind updating that was to look at this more holistically and for us to be in a far better position to kind of assess conditions as well as tee up responses and preparedness, both from a local all the way up to a state level. And what kinds of actions we need to put into place prior to a drought condition so that when we are in a drought, we are better able to deal with the impacts and see as minimal impacts to human health as well as to the environment. We know both of those sides are obviously impacted during a drought, and so that certainly becomes important for us to look at it holistically. So we'll certainly take the other comments that you made on sustainable water management and the DEP process and the Water Management Act back with us and have a conversation, a separate conversation with DEP on that. But I think you'll be happy to see some of the other strides we've made, holistically on various other aspects of water use, water management. Obviously, nothing is perfect, but it's all about how you constantly make improvements and how you better balance what the environment needs versus what we need. It's a constant sort of a balancing act. Our mission at EEA is to make sure we restore, enhance, protect the natural resources through this a practical lens of balancing. And I think that's what we've been able to do, especially on the drought and drought management.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? You can raise your hand. Actually, there's a question in the chat from Darcy. I can read it to the group. I'm wondering how the task force and state are managing water equity, specifically how outdoor watering, typically in wealthier communities, are having a detrimental impact on a statewide critical resource.
That's a great question. Our message on water use is to everybody, a rich community, a poor community, whether you live in an urban setting or in a suburban or a rural setting. We try to be sort of a little agnostic of that because irrespective of whether you're rich or poor, I think we're all experiencing these sort of natural conditions in a similar way. But having said that, obviously we're being impacted differently, and the type of assistance that we would need to provide, in particular to those communities that are feeling a disproportionate sort of overload or disproportionate impact from this inequity, is something that's always on our mind. We are always thinking about how we can make resources available and to bear. In terms of water supply, there are a couple of big regional water suppliers in the state. As many of you know, the MWRA system gets its water from 2 reservoirs out in central and western Massachusetts and supplies water to 45 cities and towns in the greater Boston area, mostly urban and suburban communities. And then there's the Worcester system as well. But most of the other water supply systems are local. And as you know, as far as we know, seem to have right now enough water. They also have a different approach locally, town by town, in how they reach out to lower income or lower income people within their communities, either providing them water at a lower rate, and so on and so forth. So we have not seen as much of the inequity, although we are aware and constantly seeking information on how water use in general is impacting all water users.
Okay, thank you, Vandana. That was a good explanation. Does anybody else have a question? You can either use the chat box or raise your hand.
And maybe I can pose a question to the audience.
Sure.
What would you find useful by way of information sharing from the state out to you and others? Do some of the social media assets that I shared, do those resonate with you? Is that something that you feel you can use? Are they easy to understand and succinct? Or is there, so I mean, I'll stop there. I have another question, but you know, maybe some folks, if they have any thoughts or anything they want to share on those, that would be helpful to us.
Okay, and yeah, feel free to use the chat box to answer that. We do have Vandana, we do have a question from Colleen. How does a community get a monitoring station in its community? Swansea has had less than 1/10 of an inch during the last 2 months. Or Nicole, maybe you can answer that. I think we're talking about rainfall.
Yeah. Oh, Vandana, did you want to respond?
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
And maybe Gardner may have something to add on the USGS side as well.
Sure. So for Swansea, I would say maybe an additional resource. It's a rainfall measuring network called COCORAS, a community collaborative rain, hail, and snow network, and there's quite a few stations throughout Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and nationally. There are volunteer observers that report mainly rain and snow year round. And actually, I'm in Rehoboth. So if you were to go onto the cocoras.org website, you would be able to see the rainfall from Rehoboth from my station. But you could set up a COCORAS network. There are manual gauges that and they're all, like I said, all volunteer observers report once daily and typically in the morning, the 24-hour precipitation. So that could be one way of monitoring. If you put a station in, then you could document the rainfall over time, and then have it as a record to look back at. I know for me, it's nice to be able to look back, you know, and the cooperative weather observers too, from the National Weather Service standpoint, you know, being able to look at that rainfall day after day and on a historical basis, it's very helpful.
Yeah, and Nicole, we should add too, we do use the COCORAS data for our monthly reports to Massachusetts, as well as Rhode Island and Connecticut. So it's a good way kind of to fill the gaps. We have airport stations, we have the co-op observers, and the other sources we showed you. But these, the COCORAS observers, there's over 400 in the 3 states, many of whom are reporting just about every day, especially being home with COVID restrictions. So we do use that data to fill in the gaps. But Colleen, if you know, if you're in Swansea and you want to measure rain in your area, just go to cocoras.org, and you can order a gauge, sign up, and start reporting, and it would help us in our reports. So we highly encourage that. Thanks, Nicole.
Can we put the COCORAS web link or email in the chat window for everybody to see? Just want to make sure people get the spelling correct.
We sure can. I will do that here. Let's see.
And Gardner, is there anything you want to add on the USGS in case, you know, just to address the issue of more
Yeah,
data stream or from?
Yeah, I'm assuming it was about precip, and we do have a precip site in Fall River, I believe, and that's online that she could look at, and that's fairly close to Swansea. But if she wants something specific to Swansea, then it sounds like Coco Rouse would be a good way to go.
Absolutely, yeah, and the more reports we have, the better the data we can provide to the states. So it's a good way to help out. Vandana, I do have a comment from Ariella. She said you could make a presentation to my MMA policy committee on energy and the environment.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. Ariella, let's connect offline. You see my email on the screen. Please shoot me a quick email and we can certainly find a time. I'd love to come and talk to them. And that was going to be my next question to folks. Are there other people out there you think who would benefit from this presentation, who we should be reaching out to? We've reached out to many folks in the environmental community, the water supply community, and others and other municipalities as well. But we're always looking for ways in which we can communicate better and more widely to folks within Massachusetts about our drought determinations and what they can do about it and where they can get more information from.
Great. Yeah, and again, the email addresses are up on the screen, so feel free to contact anyone there. From Sylvia, we have, would you find it helpful to meet with other New England states each month during drought conditions of level 2 or above? NIDIS could assist in this effort. So Vandana, I don't know if there's on your end collaboration with, say, Rhode Island, Connecticut, maybe New Hampshire, or even Vermont.
So certainly through our federal partners, we do connect with our neighboring states in the sense that we know what's happening. We get a sense of what the conditions are. But I am certainly in touch with Connecticut and Rhode Island, and we have started to be on each other's mailing lists and attend each other's task force meetings as and when possible. This Thursday, when we are having our task force meeting, Connecticut has its almost at a concurrent time as well. So we do keep track of what's going on. I haven't yet gone to the stage of coordinating on response actions, but certainly if and when conditions start to get to that point of severity, we likely would. But on the science side, we certainly are at a level where we're keeping tabs on what's happening in our neighboring states, because we share the hydrology, we share watersheds with those states, and knowing what's happening there impacts us and vice versa. So thank you for that. Did you say in the comment that it says somebody can help with coordination? I missed that part.
The NIDIS, yes, she could.
NIDIS, yes.
NIDIS, yep.
Yep. Yes, we would love for NIDIS to help with some of that. And Sylvia, I know you and I have been in touch with each other, and we should certainly talk more about how we can enhance coordination among the New England states.
Yep. And Gardner provided a link to the USGS Fall River precipitation gauge, so I put that in the chat if anyone's interested in that. Let's see, I don't see any other hands raised, so I think we're good. All right, so with that, I think we'll wrap this up. And again, thank you to Vandana, Ann, Nicole, and Gardner for presenting today and providing a lot of good information on the Massachusetts Drought Management Task Force. We are recording this, so we will make the recording available, and Ann and Vandana will share this with you as well afterwards, so you can just distribute this as you like. But again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And we will talk to you soon. Thanks again. And we'll leave the contact information up there for a minute or two. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thanks.